All right. I see the numbers still slowly ticking up, but let's get started anyway. I'm glad to see that so many of you have made it on a sort of random Wednesday evening in January. All right, so this session is going to be a little bit more about historiography. I always think that before starting to talk about the history of something, you ought to talk about just what it is you're talking about, because of course not everybody has a background as a historian, and it's always interesting for people to realize that we often know much less than we think that we do about the history that we're speaking about. So on that sort of note, my question for you, I have a bit of a thought experiment. You can pop the answers in the chat if you want, or you can just cogitate about it in your minds. And my question to you is, what is happening right now? Now, some of you will say this sort of a very obvious thing. You're sitting in front of your computers or your iPads or your phones or your whatnot, and you are listening to me asking you what is happening in this place, this virtual place right now. But of course, that's not all that's happening. And interestingly enough, Zoom gives us a much better insight into this than, for example, I had on Monday when I did the same thing at our church. So it's obvious to me looking at your videos that some of you are eating dinner. Some of you are sitting with a friend or a partner or someone, guest in your home, for example, listening to this. You might have been talking to each other before we all got started. Some of you are in your kitchens and some in your sitting rooms. And some of you, somebody has a beautiful bookcase lined study. Can I just say how much I love that? So the fact that you are listening to me is not all that's happening in this place. So what would I do as a historian if I were to try to write a full and comprehensive and unassailable history of this night? I would have to know a lot more than, say, I would get from the Cathedral Theology Network website, which tells you that there is a series of lectures and what this lecture is about. But of course, as a historian, that only gives me, a fingernail's depth worth of the information that I would need if I were to write a history of this time, of this place. So the thought experiment that I have for you, and we'll come to this again at the end, so hold that thought, is if somehow I as a historian or you as a historian were able to gather all of the potential information about the intersecting threads of all of your lives that meet in this moment, would I, as a historian, with all of that information, be able to write a full and comprehensive and unassailable sort of history of this evening? So hold that thought and we'll come back to it. But this brings me on to a question. What can we actually know about history? Is there an entity called the past, which is accessible as such? An entity called the past, which we can access as the past. So when we think about history, and certainly we are often encouraged, not the least by schools, for example, to think of history as a timeline. There's the past, we are living in the present, and then there's the future. So if we're thinking about history, imagine that I'm an A-level student, for example, and I'm studying history. That's the paper that I'm writing. So I am told that there is prehistory, then there's the ancient Greeks, then there's the ancient Romans, then there's the Middle Ages, and then there's the Tudors, who were somehow distinct in their own time period. And then we skip along to the Victorians because the Georgians don't count for some reason. And then we get to World War II, and now we are where we are now. So that's history. That's history as a timeline. And we think, okay, so there are these discrete moments in the past that we can study, and they are sort of accessible as such. I'm here to tell you that that is not the case at all. We don't have history as a timeline, as an entity that is accessible in and of itself. What we have as historians is the past in the present. Let's think about that for a moment. What does that actually mean? So I, for example, a couple weeks ago, went to the London Metropolitan Archives, and I held in my hands, actually in my arms, because it weighs about 15 pounds, a gathering together of a lot of medieval wills. Most of them are about 700 years old. So I was holding all of this 700-year-old parchment in my hands. But of course, what I had is things that were written. They are authentic documents, 700 years old. They were written in the Middle Ages, but they exist now in the present, and I'm accessing them as sources in the present. So what we have when we look at the Middle Ages are, by definition, the sources that still exist, the buildings that still exist. So what we have is the past, artifacts from the past that exist in the present, and we are trying to access the time in which they were created by looking through the narrow keyhole of the existing sources at history. Now, we don't necessarily know what portion of all of the available material our sources represent, but even if they represented everything that was ever produced in the Middle Ages, which obviously they can't, we do not know, and we cannot know as historians, all that could potentially be known about the past. And that brings us to a sort of interesting conclusion, which is that, contra some of the folks, in the middle of last century, these sort of thinkers who posited the end of history actually can never end. History actually can never be fully written, not least because we don't always have access to all of the sources, and new ones are found, of course, every day. And sources are also lost, frankly, so we can lose information very easily as well. History can never be fully written, not only because of the problem of sources, but because, of course, different things are salient to different historians in different times. So, for example, the Victorian antiquarians who put together the patent rolls, the records of the medieval state, were not remotely interested in my topic of specialism, which is crusading. So you will almost never see the word crusade in the patent rolls. But yet, if you go to the actual documents, which these patent rolls are meant to represent, you will, of course, find crusading stuff in there. But of course, that wasn't salient to the historians of the Victorian era. They didn't care, and so it didn't make it into what they wrote. So different things become salient to different historians in different times. And so history is inescapably unfinished. And it is inescapably bound up with the consciousness, with the interests, with the ideas, with the selves of the people who are writing history. And that's very important to remember as we talk about what is historical fact, etc. It's not that there are not facts, but it's very important to realize where the historians are coming from who are sort of presenting to you these facts. Now, the thing that might sort of blow your mind, I'm going to sort of continue with a mystery. Behold, I tell you a mystery, friends. What I've just said about history in general applies to ourselves also. So think about this. St. Augustine of Hippo, who was one of the greatest geniuses I think the church has ever produced. And he had a very profound influence on Western theology throughout the Middle Ages, which is why I want to talk about him, even though he's from the 5th century. Now, St. Augustine, great genius. he's not infallible, and there are a few sort of doctrines that he promulgated that I think make any sane, sensible, rational person want to put him through a brick wall occasionally. We'll come on to one of those in session 4. But Augustine is impossible not to engage with if you're studying the church in the Middle Ages, even the English church, although Augustine was obviously from North Africa. So in his famous book, The Confessions, chapters sort of 1 through 10 read like an autobiography, although they're not, and we'll come on to what they actually are in a minute. The Confessions after chapter 10 starts to get really weird, because Augustine starts talking about memory and time. Augustine says that memory is a bit of a mystery. It's not located anywhere. So there is no such thing as my memory, which is separate from myself. I can't have myself sitting here in this room and then point to my memory somewhere else outside of me. So memory is not located anywhere, but it intersects with us where we are in time and space. That's a little bit difficult to think about in an abstract manner. So he gives us an example. So think of singing along with the radio, for example. You know the song and you are able to produce the words somehow to sing along as you're singing along with the radio. But where are the words coming from? Because you're not consciously thinking about them as they're coming out of your mouth. Otherwise, you could never keep up with the singer on the radio. Yet these words are coming from somewhere, and they are going out of your mouth into the time when you are sitting, singing with the radio. So Augustine sort of points this out. He says, memory, in a sense, makes us. Memory is what we are. Our personalities, our patterns of thought, etc., are made by our memories, by the things that have happened to us. But memory is not available for inspection as such. We cannot consciously recall everything that has ever happened to us. So much of what we are as human beings is absent from our conscious minds, in the same way that so much of what went into historical events is absent from our ability to see it, to recall it, to know it as historians. So we are not transparent either to ourselves, and we are certainly not transparent to our posterity. We are inescapably unfinished, and so is our history. Now, Augustine said, and the medieval folks would agree with him, that to work out who we are, we need to be speaking and listening to God through prayer. Augustine says that the only way to know oneself is to stand before God and to sort of consciously open yourself to being known by him, which is to pray. And so Augustine's Confessions is not an autobiography so much as it is an extended prayer to God. He is laying himself out to be known, and therefore, and thereby, by praying to God, learning about himself, knowing himself. Okay, so this gets us onto something that is very important to remember about the medieval mind, medieval consciousness. And this is why I called the session The World Made Strange, because medieval people are a lot like us. Obviously, human nature does not change so much in 1,000 years. We're not a completely different species. But it's important to understand that they saw the world through a very different set of basic assumptions than we have. And the reason why I bring up Augustine is that it gets into sort of one of those assumptions. So I'll give you the example, for example, of friendship. So Augustine says that the only way to know oneself is to stand before God and to consciously open yourself to be known by him. Well, that comes with a corollary, which is that the only way to be known to others is to stand before God with them, for them to be known by God. And therefore, through that sort of interchange, through that, Charles Williams would call it coherence. Never mind that, we'll come on to it in another session. So the only way to be known to others is to stand before God with them. But of course, unless we are brave to the point of foolhardiness, we never explicitly say to our friends, come stand before me with God and allow yourself through him to be known to me. Like, we don't say that, obviously. We instead say, would you like to go to the pub with me? How about lunch? But of course, that's what these things amount to. So everything you love about your friends and the things that you share together, it finds its fullness and perfection in God. And so the things that you love about them come from him, they participate in him. Now you would say, well, this is a very sort of high and noble and solemn view of life, that literally everything we do and everything we are is imbued with theological significance, that nothing, absolutely nothing, is untouched by God in anything we do or say or are. Yes, but this is how medieval people, generally speaking, if you read their literature, this is how they thought about friendship, how they thought about the self, how they thought about time. And you cannot understand them without the idea that they believe that everything they do is somehow imbued with theological significance. And that is the biggest difference between the way we live now, the way we understand the world now, and the way they understood the world in the Middle Ages. I mean, it is a high and solemn view of life if everything you do fundamentally matters. But the wonderful thing about the Middle Ages, reading their literature, trying to understand them, is yes, it's a high and solemn view of life, but it's a high solemnity that is always on the verge of breaking out into joyous laughter. And that joy is what makes studying the Middle Ages such a pleasure. It's certainly, I think, what made for an easy yoke and a light burden for them as they went about living their lives. I mean, if you really want a millstone around your neck, try thinking that nothing you do matters rather than that everything you do matters. And medieval folks would point out to you that this is, frankly, the way that Jesus lived as well. And of course, what does he say in calling the disciples friends, except stand with me before the God that is now our Father, your Father and mine. Now, I think sadly in the sort of woke era, we have to address the fact that medieval people often fell short of this high calling. They often fell short of this grand view of life. The Middle Ages was full of, war and unpleasantness just as much as the modern era is. But of course they fell short of this high calling, as does anybody who stands up in a church and speaks beautiful words of which their subsequent actions fall painfully short. So forgive the medieval people, forgive everybody who stands up and lectures at you on Zoom or in a church. Forgive them, forgive us, as you yourselves hope to be forgiven. So that's my little apologia for the medieval people, and a sort of a little keyhole insight into their view of life. And we'll come back to Augustine, we'll come back to memory time in just a moment. But first, I want to talk about sort of the mechanics, how these sessions are going to work, which is what you do in an introductory session. Okay, so we have, over the next 5 sessions, we're going to talk about the church in England in the Middle Ages. Yes, we're going to talk about the history. We are going to talk about names and dates and movements and sort of machinations and politics and ecclesiastical bureaucracy and buildings and all of those sorts of things. We're going to talk about the sort of nuts and bolts of history. Absolutely. But the other thing, and I think the more important thing that I want to give you a sense of, is who these people were. What kind of culture, society made, say, Chichester Cathedral or St. Bartholomew the Great, which is my own church in London. who were these people and what kind of preoccupied them? And there were a few things that did preoccupy them, and we'll talk about love and death and memory and beauty and language alongside politics, ecclesiastical bureaucracy, buildings, what it was actually like going to church, etc., etc. But what's more difficult to convey in a book is who these people were, and that's what we'll explore as well. So if you want a sort of general history with all of your names and dates and facts, I recommend reading one alongside this class. Here's one that I recommend, and I'll send out an email with the reference to this. It is the former Bishop of Ripon, I think. Yes, former Bishop of Ripon, John Mormon's History of the Church in England. You don't have to write it down. I'll send you out an email with this. And I think even though it was written in the late 1960s, it's still one of the best general histories of the Church of England that goes all the way from the Roman times to the eve of the Reformation without necessarily being too polemical, which thank God for that. But like I said, I'll send you an email with a reference to that. Okay, so I say that we're going to talk about, yes, politics, ecclesiastical bureaucracy, but also the light and shadow and texture and color and sound and emotion of the church in the Middle Ages. But that doesn't seem, or that might not seem, to address the elephant in the room, which is the Reformation. So, of course, we have numerous people, everyone from sort of Martin Luther in Germany to, John Fox and William Tyndale in England, claiming that the medieval English church was corrupt and venial and in decline and, sort of better swept away by the clean broom of the Reformation. So you might tell me, isn't what we'll be exploring over the next 5 sessions simply the rise, decline, and fall of apostolic Christianity in England? So the medieval English church swept away an authentic Christianity, which was founded in the teachings of the early church and the church fathers, and the true religion was lost under the accretions of centuries until at last it was purged and restored to beauty by the reforms of the 16th century. Isn't that just what we're going to be talking about? In a word, no. As Jane Austen once said about gossip, the stream is as good as at first, and the little rubbish it collects in the turnings is very easily moved away. Medieval people also read and understood the church fathers. The medieval English church had apostolic Christianity. It had, if you want true Christianity, it had it. So we're not going to embark on this sort of, decline and fall and veniality narrative, because that simply wasn't the case. And as a historian, I would caution you to not embark on learning, certainly not embark on research if you already think you know what the answer is going to be. So instead of asking why the Reformation happened, or why some people would say it needed to happen, I wouldn't necessarily, but so instead of asking why the Reformation happened, we're going to ask how. And the reason for that is by looking to find why the Reformation happened, we inevitably begin to pile up causes one after the other. So the Reformation goes from seeming possible to seeming probable to seeming inevitable. The causal pressure sort of mounts and mounts and mounts when we ask why, and it leaves no room for individuals and their decisions. So when you ask why the Reformation happened, it squeezes the actual people of the Middle Ages out of the picture of their own history, and you can't see them clearly anymore. And that's not what we want. Likewise, when we ask why, the question also inevitably arises of who. So it was King Henry VIII in the palace with a statutory instrument, like it's a game of Cluedo or something. And history becomes a search for good guys and bad guys, which is not particularly useful as historians. So, and just to say, for an understanding of the Reformation in England, you would also need to look at multiple states, because reform movements happened all over. And the English church, it's so important to realize this. The English church was not hermetically sealed. It had an international character from the beginning. People came in from all over Europe to take up places in the English church. English prelates went over to Europe and took places there. So when you're talking about the English church, you are, in a sense, talking about the history of Christendom in Europe as well. So we're not going to search for good guys and bad guys. We're not going to ask why. We're going to talk about how the English church came to be and how it developed, a sort of journey of events, things that made reform more or less likely, etc. And all of these events might not be, and I'm going to argue that quite probably they were not, occurring in conjunction with any particular plan or program of action or intention. This is not a sort of, shadowy cabal of the Illuminati who are moving the English church backwards and forwards. This was an organic thing, for everything from the Archbishop of Canterbury down to the individual priest and parishioner in a parish that would never have, that wouldn't have been able to tell you who the Archbishop of Canterbury was at any particular point in the Middle Ages. Okay, some people are going to say, they're going to ask the very sensible question of, do we actually want to look at the history of the medieval English church through the lens of the Reformation, though? Why would we want to do that? Because, of course, the medieval English church is intrinsically interesting. It's worth studying on its own terms. It's worth drawing from our present faith. It's worth engaging with on its own terms. And definitely it is. It's a beautiful and wonderful and light-filled and textured thing on its own. But in a sense, we have to address the Reformation, because most of what separates us from engaging with the medieval English church comes out of the Reformation. It's a propagandistic holdover from then. So most of what people have been taught or what they've picked up about the medieval English church comes from Tudor propagandists like William Tyndale and John Fox, who kind of had a dog in the fight, you might think. Or it comes from Enlightenment propagandists, and they were propagandists like Voltaire or David Hume, or people who also had a dog in the particular fights of their time. But by this point, most people don't even realize where their information on the medieval English church comes from. It's been so distilled in our culture that these were, superstitious morons who, sold indulgences and thought they could buy their way into heaven. That's been so distilled into a sort of talking point that most people don't realize, number one, that it's not true, and number two, where it actually comes from. But of course, if we say correctly that we only have the past in the present, well, that of course applies to historical people who wrote history as well. So these propagandists or these people were writing history in their own present. They were addressing the past based on the needs of their own present time to prop up their works in the moment, or even to just try to understand what it was that they were trying to push against as a reform movement. And I'll give you a wonderful example of this. So the Ecclesiastical Appeals Act 1532, it's also often called the Statute in Restraint of Appeals. So this was basically Henry VIII saying nobody can go to the Pope anymore for adjudication of any complaints. The act begins with these words: whereby diverse sundry old authentic histories and chronicles, it is manifestly declared and expressed that this realm of England is an empire, ... Okay, where is he getting, or where are the people who are drafting this act getting the idea that England is an empire? This is 1532, so Britannia did not yet rule the waves. So what are we talking about regarding empire? And the answer is, it goes all the way back to Geoffrey of Monmouth, onto a chronicle called the Prose Brute, which took a lot of stuff from Geoffrey. Do you know what they say about how England was founded? England was founded when Brutus, the son of Aeneas of Troy, brought a bunch of Trojan people over to the Isle of Britain after they were defeated. So English people, if you are English, you are the descendants of the lost Trojans of the Iliad. Congratulations. I bet you didn't know that. But of course, the idea that Brutus, hence Britain, was the son of the heir of the Trojan Empire, and therefore the English state that he founded is an empire. You say, okay, well, they were being sort of cynical. You know, they're taking these old medieval chronicles that are manifestly nonsense, and they're claiming they believe them in order to prevent us talking to the Pope, right? The truth is much more difficult than that. The truth is that they actually believed it. And that's the important thing to remember, is they're a lot less, sometimes they're cynical, but actually they're a lot less cynical than you think. So we have to deal with what the people that we're studying thought about their own history when we are trying to deal with what happened in the past. Okay. There's one last thing that I'll say about the Reformation and about historiography and about people who have dogs in fights. So it is nearly impossible to write the history of the medieval English church, even today, without writing polemic. If we think about the two most famous living historians of the medieval English church and of the Reformation, one of them is emeritus at Oxford and one of them is emeritus at Cambridge. You all know who I'm talking about. I'm not trying to slander them. They're both genuinely lovely men. But of course, one of them is a Roman Catholic. And of course, he writes the histories that say, no, the medieval English church was thriving and beautiful and wonderful and everything was happy and jolly and everybody really believed and it was great. And then the other is a deacon in the Church of England, and he has a more evangelical bent. And of course, he writes about how sort of corrupt, venial, etc., the late medieval English church was, and how the Reformation was a beautiful, wonderful thing. I am only slightly exaggerating their positions for purposes of this. So it's very difficult. And it's not just them. Of course, you know, their PhD supervisors did the same thing, and their supervisors all the way back to the Victorian era, when modern sort of medieval historiography really got going. So this is not a problem with them. This is a problem with the fact that when we try to write history, it's very difficult to get around our own confessional differences and beliefs. So to that end, somebody who's actually on this call asked me last week what my slant was, whether I would be presenting new research or sticking to generally agreed interpretations, which is the right question to ask. That is absolutely the right question to ask. Two things. So the first is, there's a problem in that what is generally agreed? You're going to find it sort of very difficult to understand or to know what is generally agreed. But to try to answer that question, you know, in the good spirit in which it was asked, I'm going to try to be fairly neutral where possible. I loved the Middle Ages and I loved the history of the church long before I actually came back to the Church of England. So I hope that I don't start from too much of a confessional slant. But, you know, feel free to skewer me in the questions. That is perfectly okay with me. All right, so I said at the beginning, and just as a sort of parting gift and an earnest for next time in the last 5 minutes, I asked you earlier, given the vicissitudes of time and memory, how could we possibly write history? What exactly is the history we're attempting to write? So, you remember that I asked you earlier, if somehow as a historian, I was able to gather all of the information about all of the intersecting threads of people's lives that meet in this moment, would I be able to write a full history of this evening, a history that was defensible, that was sort of unassailable, that was final? The answer, according to Augustine, I would also agree with this, obviously, is no. Because, of course, we have, as we talked about before, the impossibility of being fully transparent to ourselves, and the impossibility, therefore, of being fully transparent to our posterity. So even if you wrote a sort of diary entry, spent evening on Zoom, worst lecture I have been to ever, that wouldn't necessarily give a historian the ability to write your full thoughts and reactions to this evening. So we can't reconstruct absolutely all human history, even if we had all of the human sources, even if you wrote stuff down, even if I interviewed you. Because, number one, you're not transparent, but number two, of course, it's simply impossible to human historians to follow all the possible threads and enumerate every single contingent cause that brings something about. There's a problem of salience. So this evening looks a lot different if I'm writing my biography versus, say, Dan's biography versus, say, I don't know, Kara's biography. This evening looks a lot different. I look at different sources. I take different things from the sources that I have based on what type of history I am attempting to write. There's not only that, but of course, different historians, yes, they ask different questions, but also the same historian asks different questions at different times. So for example, I ask a lot different questions about the history of the medieval English church now than I did, many years ago as a sort of Dawkins style atheist when I was one of those sort of people. Because different things are salient to me, different questions are interesting to me now as a historian than they were when I thought that, all Christians were morons who sold indulgences, etc., etc. But Augustine and, crucially, our medieval forebears would go one further than that. Now, they would say that all history is, in a sense, salvation history. So all history is the path through which our hearts finally come to rest in God, through which we finally, as souls, return to what we were made for, which is union with God. And so, in a sense, God is the only true historian, because only God knows what things are salient to our salvation. So if you want a full, pat, unassailable history, ring upstairs. He's the only one who can do it for you. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to write history. Obviously, I'm a historian. I get paid to write history. Hey, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to write history. It just means that all history is always provisional. And, our sort of goal over the next 5 sessions is to wrestle with the unknowable, or the only provisionally knowable, together. And that's it. Questions, comments, pop them in the chat. I'm so glad that you're all here. All right, we have a few folks who are sort of popping stuff in the chat. And while people are coming up with questions, I will say that the next session is on the Christianization of England. So 7 p.m. next Wednesday, right here on Zoom. Come along for that. Now, there's a homework question that I have for you, which is ponder. When do you think the Christianization of England actually took place? Now, that's a bit of a provocative question. So cogitate for next week, have recourse to Mormon's excellent book. If you get it, it's still in print and it's fairly cheap on Amazon. It's about 10 quid. So it's worth sort of reading just for itself. All right. So there's some folks in the chat, and this is interesting. There's a lot of talk about, so, are the Tudors medieval? If so, why are we talking about Henry VIII, etc.? Now, this is very, very interesting because, of course, when do the Middle Ages stop? And when does what historians call the early modern era begin? Ooh, periodization and historiography. This is always a very difficult question. So we can say, okay, the Middle Ages ended in 1485 with the accession by conquest of Henry VII. So he kills Richard III really horribly at the Battle of Bosworth, and thus endeth the Middle Ages. Of course, they didn't think about it that way. Nobody ever really thinks about periodization when they're living through a period in history. Nobody after the Great War suddenly said, okay, we're in the postmodern era now. They didn't do that, obviously. So you can make an argument for 1485 because there's a change of dynasty and Henry VII comes in. Now, you can make an argument for 1509, which is the accession of Henry VIII. Now, Henry VII, I will say, absolutely medieval king, not only because his reign starts in 1485, but because his patterns of government, his sort of way of being in the world, quintessentially and beautifully medieval. So we will talk about a little bit about Henry VII. Now, you can make an argument that the Middle Ages in England ended in 1509 with the accession of Henry VIII. Now, but the problem is, of course, that he continues a lot of his father's policies and, of course, his way of being in the world. Henry VIII doesn't obviously launch right into the Reformation. He gets the title from the Pope, Defender of the Faith, by writing a polemic against Martin Luther. In fact, 2 sets of polemics against Martin Luther. So I think that it's really important, if we're talking about the sort of the end, the fuzzy end of the medieval church, then we have to go into the reign of Henry VIII. So yes, in a sense, we're talking about the long Middle Ages because we're going to take it right up to the eve of the Reformation. I think we're going to stop in 1532 with the Statute and Restraint of Appeals. And as to when the Middle Ages begin, well, we have, of course, the same problem of periodization. So do we start, for example, with, as Elizabeth just said, Augustine arriving at Canterbury? Now, that's quite interesting. We could start with the Gregorian missions, and I think that is where we're going to start in terms of really talking about the meat of stuff. But Christianity arguably came to England before that, in the 1st or 2nd centuries AD. And I'm not a late antique historian, so we're not going to be talking a lot about the Romans in Britain and the late antique history of England, just because before my time. So yes, we're talking roughly about the 4th century to the early 16th or so for purposes of this class. And I love the idea that, we're already talking about periodization and historiography in the first session. That's a really good thing. Okay, other questions, comments, etc. Let's see, what is a beginning? And that's a very interesting question. And this is my provocative homework question for you for next time. When do you think the Christianization of England actually started? Now, do you want to make the case that it starts with the Gregorian missions, with the landing of Augustine at Canterbury? I think that is a perfectly defensible place to start. Now, you could also start, if you wanted to, you could start quite late in the 8th century with, Alfred, for example, or you could start quite early with the remnants of the Roman Empire. And of course, Origen, for example, is talking about England as a place where Christians can be found, and Origen is writing very early. So indeed, a beautiful question, and that's an excellent question from Robert, is what is the beginning? And that's one of the things that we'll talk about next time. And Elizabeth mentions, and this is important to remember, that the church was a very big legal and political force in medieval England, much more so than it is now. Now we get sort of people saying, well, you know, we need bishops out of the Lords because it's a holdover from the Middle Ages. Yes, I mean, you can argue that it's a very important holdover, but it's impossible, I think, to overstate, almost impossible to overstate the influence that the church had on society at every level, from, you know, the parish level up to the sort of the councils of kings. You know, you have bishops being sent as foreign ambassadors, for example. So we'll talk about, you know, when we talk about the church in the Middle Ages, it's not just, you know, people going on a Sunday. We're literally talking about the entirety of medieval English society. Oh, now that's a very interesting and provocative question from Roger, who says, what sort of judgment should we make about church history written by an atheist? Now, that's quite interesting. I mean, I would say I didn't get too interested in church history when I was an atheist, because, hey, I was an atheist and all of those Christians are fools, right? But I do have colleagues and some Crusades historians, actually, who are sort of still strong Dawkins-style atheists. I would say that it can go one of two ways, and you need to sort of make a judgment about the history that you were writing. Now, you can say, in a way, that being an atheist makes you have sort of no dog in the confessional fight, and so you could theoretically be more neutral, more sort of non-judgmental. You could just sort of take the facts in very big air quotes as you find them, and therefore you could write a neutral history. I think oftentimes, depending on the person in question, it doesn't necessarily make them neutral so much as it makes them, I don't know, almost sort of unwilling to take the claims made by medieval people at face value. You know, because surely nobody could believe that a prayer written to the Blessed Virgin on a scroll of paper tied round the pregnant woman's belly would actually give her an easier time in childbirth. Surely nobody could ever believe that. And you could say, okay. And so if your atheism makes you sort of unwilling to engage with belief as belief and understand that people can actually sort of hold these ideas and hold them in good faith, then it can skew the history that you're writing. So the answer is it depends. Gary asks, at what point in the future would the Middle Ages stop being the Middle Ages and become antiquity? Now that's quite interesting. I don't know. And there's a nice provocative question for you. Nick says, do we not also need to look at England from the Celtic standpoint? Was this not earlier than Augustine came to Canterbury? And the answer is yes. I think that is eminently sensible. You know, you have, bless them, sort of monks in Ireland standing up to their chins in, you know, the cold water, reciting the Psalms. God love them. I couldn't do it. But yes, so we'll talk about those, what was going on in Ireland, in Scotland a little bit, although it's a whole nother set of classes, basically. Elizabeth says, surely a lot of medieval churchmen were atheists. I don't know, were they? Where did you find that? How do you know? Judy says, should we be making judgments? Surely we know that different views threads help us to appreciate a fuller picture of a period/event. Absolutely true, although I would say don't let your non-judgmentalism, which is a good thing, get in the way of understanding where people are coming from, which is an essential part of understanding history and what they're writing. Just because you identify, the stream of history or the point of view that somebody comes from doesn't mean that you're saying they're wrong or bad for holding that. That's not the case. You just need, from a historiographical point of view, to understand what you're working with. Let's see. What changed my mind about God? God. So, I guess we might briefly glance on that, but when we talk about sort of faith-seeking understanding. Celtic saints, Augustine, was there a complete loss of Christianity when the Romans left / no evidence one way or another? That is a fascinating question, and we are definitely going to get into that next time. I don't think that it was a complete loss. I think that it's never been a complete loss. And so we'll get into that quite a lot more next time, because it's basically what we're going to be talking about. In what context are we speaking about England being Christianized? The crown, law, and society's structure might have been Christianized, but has the nation as a group of individuals as a whole been Christianized within their hearts and minds? Now, that is a really, really interesting question, and hold that thought, because that is the next session, essentially. Martin says, the problem surely is that the facts are not available anyway, history based on research being a matter of reading previously written and therefore biased histories. Yes, no. We still have primary sources. We have historical sources, and we have, not only written records, but it's important to also look at all the stuff that medieval people have left. Say all of the beautiful churches in Norfolk, for example, if you've ever been there. If you haven't been there, what are you doing with your life? Go to Norfolk, go to some of those churches, because it's not just the written records, but also the stuff that people left behind that tells you a lot about medieval Christianity. And you can say, obviously that is not neutral in terms of facts, because some stuff has survived and some stuff is not, because vicissitudes of intervening history. It's not that you can never get to any facts at all. It's just that you have to say the view that we have is always provisional. So what looks to us like a fact now, it's subject to being revised, but we have, the best possible or best available view of history at the moment. And Elizabeth says, if it's right that the church was a legal and political construct, there would have been no need to believe to succeed in the medieval church. I don't think that's true. The church was more than just a legal and political construct, although it was obviously that. It was a legal and political force. But I don't think, for example, that you have, just to take a very late example, I don't think that after the dissolution of some monasteries begins, that you would have people newly professing themselves as monks if they didn't believe. I don't think that you would have a lot of parish priests who were laboring in really awful conditions if they didn't believe. And when you read, for example, you look at the beautiful sort of devotional works and things like that some bishops commissioned, I think that most of them believed. And so, it's the sort of plague of later historiography to say, oh, well, all of these people, they just wanted to get on, they just wanted to make themselves rich. They just wanted ... It was a way for second sons and poor people to come into wealth. I'm sure there were a few, like there are in any era, but I don't think that the church would have survived if it was riddled with people from top to bottom who didn't believe but just wanted to get on. There was not enough getting on to make it really attractive to people who actually didn't believe. Dawn says +1, re Norfolk. So yes, while people are still doing staycations because it's difficult to get abroad, you know, feel free, like, descend. There are other, you know, beautiful churches elsewhere in the country as well. But, and Val says, was the English church wholly connected with Rome, or was there influence from Byzantium? Now that is quite interesting, and we'll talk about that a little bit next time. Certainly, it was quite interesting. You have a lot of Anglo-Saxons, or what we can't call Anglo-Saxons anymore. Sorry, you have quite a lot of Anglo-Saxons going over to the Byzantine Empire as sort of jobbing mercenaries, and of course they encounter the Byzantine church there. Now, it is debatable to what sort of degree they bring back anything from it, but there certainly was interchange, at least between England, or, you know, what wasn't then England because it wasn't quite united, you know, between what we're going to call England for purposes of ease and Byzantium. Okay. Oh, that's a lot of questions, and you've been sort of beautifully and wonderfully engaged, and I hope that you have enjoyed this first session, and that you will come back for the next one. Keep thinking, keep asking these questions, because they're absolutely fantastic. This is precisely what we want to see. So I'll send you a follow-up email a little bit later on in the week. When this video is available, I'll send, as I said, the reference to our friend Mormon and some other things that you might want to think through. And apart from that, thank you so much for participating, and we'll see you again next Wednesday. Right. Cheers, folks. Bye-bye.